everybody, welcome. My name is Debbie Clark. I'm the director of the Faculty Collaborative for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, and we've been sponsoring these new events which are called Scholarship Across the Disciplines. They're planned by a panel of faculty that's sitting in the front row, and you'll hear more from them. And we have new involvement of students, slowly but surely too, so you hear about that. And you're going to hear about what we're doing next semester too. So I'm so glad you're here, particularly thanks to the OT department and the OT students for coming. And I'm going to turn it over to our moderator. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Nancy Bagatelle, and on behalf of the SAD committee, which includes Melissa Weiner and Eric Johnson, we are pleased to present the third in our series of a scholarship across the disciplines this semester. We began this semester with a panel about the oil spill and the Gulf crisis, and followed it up with a panel about women in politics. And this third one is about aging and older adulthood. As Debbie said, we're trying a new format to try to engage students and include students in the conversation. So what the plan is for today, we have three faculty who will be presenting. Our first speaker is Kathy Solomon, and she's an associate professor of sociology. She's been on the faculty at Quinnipiac since 2004. Her doctoral work was completed at Syracuse University. At Quinnipiac, her teaching focuses on courses related to families, aging, and gender. Dr. Solomon's research focuses on the intersections of family, gender, and work, both paid and unpaid, as well as families in later life. She has a number of publications that focus on work-life management, including her recent publication entitled "The Very Highest Thing is Family, Male Assistant Professors, Work-Family Management." Her paper today is entitled "Families in Later Life, Work and Family Issues." Our second presenter will be Marcy Sanders, and she's an associate professor of occupational therapy. Dr. Sanders has been on the faculty here since 1993, I think. Dr. Sanders earned her master's in occupational therapy, a second master's in occupational health and safety, and a PhD in health services. Her areas of expertise are ergonomics, injury prevention, occupational safety and health, and community health for older adults. Dr. Sanders' research includes a focus on issues related to older workers, adaptations to their jobs, the impact on successful aging, and generativity. One of her recent publications includes a qualitative study of two older adult workers, adaptation to physically demanding jobs, which was published in the journal Work. And our third presenter is Kathleen Zettergren. She's an associate professor of physical therapy. She has taught in the areas of neurologic rehabilitation, balance, falls, and vestibular dysfunction for over 14 years. Dr. Zettergren also has a certification in yoga, and she combines her passion for yoga and preventing falls in older adults as part of her line of research and service, and that's what she'll be discussing today. So we'll have these three presentations, and then we have two students who will be acting as discussants today. Our first discussant will be Julianne Gardner, who's a gerontology major in the College of Arts and Sciences. And our second discussant is Keneal McLennan, who is a student in the Occupational Therapy Department. And they'll each have about 5 minutes to comment about the work, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Okay, so that's the plan for today. So our first presenter is Kathy Solomon. So please join me in welcoming her. Do you know which one's the lead? Yes. Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, what a great turnout on a Friday afternoon, especially when the sun is shining. So thank you all for coming, and Nancy, thank you for inviting me to speak at this panel on aging. As Nancy said, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology, where we have a minor and a major in gerontology. So what I'm going to do today is talk about just some basic demographic information about aging and how our society is aging, tell you what gerontology is, what a gerontologist study, and then talk about my future research project. Okay, so we know that we're living in a time when the percent of people over 65 is rapidly increasing. And as you can see from the slide, that it's grown from 4% in 1900 to 12% in 2000. So why did we see this increase of 8%? Well, medical advances, which probably are of interest to you in health sciences. But really, those medical advances have increased our life expectancy. If you were born in 1900 and you were a man, you could expect to live to only age 46, and for women, age 48. So that's pretty young. In 2000, the average life expectancy was 74 for men and 80 for women. So a big increase in 100 years in the life expectancy. And it's expected that in the next 20 years, we're going to see the rate, or the percent of people over 65 increase to 20%. And that's an increase of 78%, which is a huge jump. And if you look at those numbers, it's interesting that it took 100 years for the percent of people over 65 to increase 8%. And you'll notice there that 30 years, we're expected to see another jump of 8%. So if you think about, we as a society had 100 years to adjust to an 8% increase. And it's predicted that we're going to have 30 years, 20 from now, to adjust to another 8% increase. Why are we expecting to see that increase from 12% to 20%? Well, the baby boomers. People born between 1946 and 1964. Maybe some of your professors are baby boomers, or some of the people in this room are baby boomers. But thanks to them, we're going to see this big increase. We're expecting to see this big increase to 20%. And that's actually going to start happening next year, because the oldest baby boomers are 64 now. They're going to be 65 next year in 2011. So that's when we're going to start to see these numbers really grow up. So what do these boring numbers mean? Well, if we think about it in terms of our society, this is going to have big ripple effects in policy, which is why if you ever watch the news, you hear everybody's talking about Medicare and Social Security, and wow, what are we going to do about these policies? Well, because 1 in 5 people are going to be over 65. You know, it's predicted to be, of course. We don't know for sure, but demographers who calculate these statistics are generally pretty close. So, you know, again, 1 in 5 in 2030. So we're going to see ripple effects in terms of policy, ripple effects in terms of housing options, in terms of jobs available for young people, and big changes in healthcare, with more jobs in the healthcare field geared towards helping older adults. So in fact, I was just talking to a couple of my students in my Sociology of Aging class about this. There was an OT student and 2 health sciences majors, and I said, really, everybody who's over in health sciences should be at least minoring in gerontology, because that's the wave of the future. I mean, that's where the jobs are going to be. So, well, what is gerontology? Well, gerontology is an interdisciplinary field that really kind of came together and started in the 1930s. And it looks at the biological, psychological, and sociological aspects of aging. So that means that gerontologists can study aging from a variety of perspectives. So in terms of the biology of aging, you know, how do our physical bodies age? In terms of the psychology, how does aging affect our brains? How does it affect our personalities as we get older? How does it affect our memory, our ability to learn, and so on? And then in terms of the sociology of aging, that's what's called social gerontology. So I'm a social gerontologist, and that means that I study the social aspects of aging. So what kind of topics does that include? Well, that includes things like marital relationships. What's marital satisfaction like in later life? How do people enact those marital roles, you know, over their life course? Family caregiving. How does the family dynamic change when an adult child becomes a caregiver for a parent? How does that affect a family relationship? We look at retirement satisfaction. How do people retire? Employment, economics, widowhood, and ta-da, health. But we study health in terms of the social aspects of health. So this is different from how someone in physical therapy, like Kathy, would examine, you know, how do exercises relate to having a healthy body, or in occupational therapy, like Marcy, how did job design affect aging body? Social gerontologists look at how changes in health status affects our social relationships. So how does it affect our marital relationships? How does it affect our relationships with our children, our grandchildren? And how does it affect our social roles roles, like our ability to work, and et cetera. And then we also pay attention to differences between racial ethnic groups, differences among class groups, differences between men and women. So it's really important that we examine those differences when we study the social aspects of aging. Okay, so what do I do? Well, I'm interested, as Nancy said, in the intersection of gender, family roles, and work in later life. And there's a new project that I want to explore, and this is just in the beginning stages, so this is very kind of broadly speaking. But I'm interested in how working during the quote-unquote traditional retirement years affects family relationships, and affects things like marriage, and affects things like grandparent-grandchild relationships, and also affects just how do we think about later life, and how do we think about retirement if people are working for pay? So I thought what I'd do today is talk about, well, what do social gerontologists know about each of these topics, and then get to, what kind of questions do I want to explore? So retirement for many years has begun with the age 65, because that's when people are eligible for Social Security. So much so that being old and later life is almost synonymous with retirement. That if you're old, well, aren't you retired? And retirement has traditionally been viewed as a time period that people look forward to. We have all these social rituals that help people transition into retirement. It's usually considered a time of leisure, a time to develop new activities, or revisit old activities that you've kind of put by the wayside because you were raising kids or you were working. A time to volunteer, and in general, it's a time of high life satisfaction. And of course, that depends on health status. It also depends on financial resources, but in general, retirees tend to report high life satisfaction. So that's how we kind of traditionally thought about retirement. And I could go more into depth about actually each of these topics, I should say, but this is just kind of a nutshell because I only have 15 minutes. But if you take my aging class, then you'll get much more in-depth information. Okay, so that's retirement. So family relationships. Well, in terms of marital relationships, we know that marital satisfaction at the end of life for couples who've been married for a long time tends to be really high. And the interesting thing about marital satisfaction is that it takes a U-shaped course over the life course. Or the life of a marriage, and the life course. So at the beginning, it starts out real high, yay, people are hunky-dory, everything's lovey-lovey, it's just the two of you. And then it gets real low in the middle years, okay? And those middle years, it's usually because of role strain, because people have kids, they have jobs, they have a house that needs to be maintained, they have a spouse they want to spend time with, but they can't because they have kids. So role strain really decreases marital satisfaction. But if you can just make it through those rough middle years into the later stages of marriages after the kids leave home, marital satisfaction goes back up again. Okay? And couples who are in the later stages of a marriage, they tend to report fewer marital problems, fewer arguments, they have more positive interactions, they spend lots of time together, in part because they're retired. And in essence, they've kind of worked out all of the kinks of their relationship so that, marital satisfaction is really high. So marriage is very important in later life. Grandparenthood is also a central role that a lot of older people occupy and is very important to that life stage. And on average, grandparents report feeling a very intense sense of love for their grandchildren. One that's very similar to how they feel about their own children, that the love that they feel for their own children is the same that they feel for their grandchildren. And my colleague Lynn Hodgson did a really interesting study about grandparents and grandchildren, and in terms of the frequency of contact and how they kept in touch with each other. And she found that grandchildren are in really frequent contact with their grandparents, some even reporting like weekly contact with grandparents, and that this continues even into adulthood. And in my aging class, I always ask, well, how many of you, are in contact with your grandparents on a regular basis? And they, most of them raise their hands. And I'll say, well, how often, do you talk to your grandma or your grandpa? Well, every other week, a month. Sometimes I even have someone say, oh, I talk to my grandma every week. And a lot of times students will say, well, I email with my grandma or my grandpa, or we Skype. That's also become kind of popular. And then recently, just in the past couple of years, I've had students say, oh, my grandma texts me, how are you doing? And I text her back. So technology is starting to facilitate the relationship between grandparents and grandchildren. And because the baby boomers are going to be, moving into that over 65 population soon, I think that grandparenthood is going to continue to be a real central aspect of later life. Okay. So retirement, later life, time of leisure, time to focus on your spouse, your marriage, time to focus on new endeavors, being a grandparent, etc. But a sizable minority of people over 65 still work for pay. For men, it's about a third of men are employed until 70. This is from 65 to 70. Then that decreases to a quarter between 70 and 75, and then 10% are still working after their 75th birthday. Now, women's employment is different in that it's only about a quarter of women work from age 65 to 70. Then that goes down to about 5% after 75 are still working for pay. But for those years of between 65, and I'm pointing to my screen like you can see, but for those years between 65 and 75, that actually represents a jump of about 10% from the early 1990s, which is a big increase in a short amount of time. And that upward trend is, even though we're in a recession, is still expected to increase as the baby boomers get older, because we know that the baby boomers, they still want to work even after they're 65. So it's likely that those numbers will keep going up. Now, you might think, oh, well, these are all part-time jobs, right? These are just like the greeter at Walmart, or like when I went to the doctor's office yesterday, and there was this older gentleman saying, where do you need to go? Oh, you got to go up the second floor and down the hall. And I thought, oh, I should interview you for my study. But you might think these are part-time jobs, right? Well, really, that's only women. That women who are over 65 are the ones who are working the part-time jobs. Men, over half of men who are working after 65 are working full-time jobs. So that's, kind of a significant thing. So there are people who are working. Well, what does the research say about how they feel about working? And now this is, since I'm a sociologist, I look at big numbers, big trends, so there are differences depending on class and health status. But in general, people who are working, they like to work. They report being satisfied with working. They report high levels of physical and mental health. They like that. It feels like it helps them mentally and physically. Now, as a social scientist, I say, well, is it that working is causing good mental and physical health, or is it that people who are in good physical and mental health just work longer? And we don't know. We don't know what the causal relationship is, but nevertheless, in general, they tend to report high levels of satisfaction with working and physical and mental well-being. So what I'm interested in is in exploring the work-family experiences of this group of people who are still working after the age of 65. So I'm wondering, how do they view their life stage, even though it differs from kind of the traditional view of later life? How do they manage their work responsibilities with their family responsibilities, given that, after age 65, it's supposed to be this time to focus less on work and more on family, more on your relationship with your spouse, more on being a grandparent, more on yourself? So how do they kind of manage those competing things? And, I wonder, does the type of job matter, if it's full-time or if it's part-time? Does it matter if it's a continuation of your career, or if you say, oh, I'm going to stop being a professor and I'm just going to go work at Barnes & Noble? Does that affect how you manage work and family? And do the reasons for working affect how you manage work and family, if it's an economic necessity or if it's something that you just want to do? And I'm wondering how working for pay affects marital relationships in terms of spending time with your spouse, but also the division of household labor. And is marital satisfaction still high for people who are working, and does it depend if both spouses are working or just one spouse is working? And then also, how does working affect the enactment of the grandparent role? If you're working for pay, that means you have less time to spend with your grandchildren. So how does that affect how people kind of construct themselves as a grandparent and enact that role? And I think that exploring these questions will help us understand this kind of non-traditional aspect of retirement, and perhaps help the baby boomers as they move into later life and keep working for pay, and help them figure out how they can manage work and family. And in addition, it can also help us inform policy to help older workers balance work and family. So I'll get back to you on the results of my study and let you know what I find out. Thank you.
Although I'm not approaching retirement, I'm taking my classes. Okay. Ta-da. I'm going to have to move this forward a little bit. I have to be able to see. All right. There we go. As Nancy said, I'm my name is Marcy Sanders, and I teach in occupational therapy. And I just want to get an idea of who our audience is. How many folks are occupational therapists? Okay, we win. Okay. And how many gerontologists do we have?
All the gerontologists up today.
Absolutely. Do we have anybody from the community? Thank you for coming. I appreciate that. And no business folks at all.
We're PT. We're PT.
Oh, PT. Thank you. Excellent. Well, I'm going to be talking, nurses? Nurses? I saw Mary come in. Thank you. Well, I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the folks who actually flunked retirement, okay, and are still working. I'm actually looking at work and successful aging, so thanks very much, Kathy, for giving me a really, really nice introduction. As Kathy mentioned, right now we have older adults, we have a large number of folks who are working probably two decades past retirement. And we're trying to figure out, okay, whereupon it used to be you retired and then you had a few more years and you went on Medicare, and then that was the kind of end of life. Now we're looking at how do we promote successful aging? In other words, how do we promote happiness for 2 more years after you retire and in a natural environment? We would really prefer to promote the successful aging before you develop a chronic disability versus after you develop a chronic disability and when you're really relying on healthcare professionals. So what I want to do is try to figure out what is successful aging and can work, in fact, really promote that whole successful aging process, just as Kathy said. Now, if we want to figure this out, we really need to define successful aging. So what I am going to present to you is my research. This is my dissertation research, looking at the relationship between work and successful aging. In other words, does work promote all the good stuff that Kathy had mentioned? So if we go back right now to look at successful aging, it's really interesting. Some of the gerontologists here will know that there is a wide variety of theories that are almost a little bit divergent relative to how we define it. One of them is Erickson. You probably remember generativity versus stagnation way back when. That's right. And Erickson basically said that in your older years, it's important to be able to pass on a life legacy in order to basically pass on information to other people relative to life experiences. So this whole idea of passing along life lessons. Two other folks, Baltus and Baltus, said that in order to be successful agers, you really need to be able to adapt to age-related changes. But also, it's really important to feel that you have control over your life. In other words, that you have control over life choices, whether it be where you live or what you want to do when you want to get up. Those are just two perspectives. Rowe and Kahn, they were in the 1990s, and they said, you know, the icon of looking at successful aging is having good health, is having high cognitive physical functioning, but is also staying actively engaged in life. And as occupational therapists, we really like this part of it. So it's being socially involved, it's being productive, and it's also performing meaningful activities. So those things, some of those key points that I'll come back to are how I define successful aging. I'll be more specific about that in just a second. Well, AARP did a study, and also, as Kathy said, more and more folks are entering the workforce. So individuals from 55 to 64, about 60% of those folks are still working, but even up to 22, and Kathy, you might have a different one, up to 30% are working post-retirement years. So the bottom line is that older adults are going back to work, whether it's the same job or they're staying in a little bit of a different job. And AARP found out that the reasons they're going back to work are really the psychosocial reasons that I just mentioned. So they want to stay active, they want to be productive, they want to interact with others, and yes, they would like some cold hard cash. Okay, that always helps. And actually, the policies now are really promoting older adults to go back to work or stay at work. So this is a good time. And then, from the other perspective, we probably, when us baby boomers retire, we probably will have a later shortage. So we do need older workers to some degree to stay in the workforce if, in fact, they wanted. So when I looked at all these different issues, you have older adults who want positive work experiences. You have the workplaces that are saying, you know what, we need you to stay for the labor shortage. So we want all these wonderful things to happen, but we really do not know what is a good work experience for older workers. And that's what I really wanted to look at. What is the relationship between work and this concept of successful aging? So when I looked at the work experience, that's pretty broad. I wanted to look at one thing really specific, and that's the job design, as Kathy said. So there are several theories of that, but I'll just kind of focus on what we're here today for. And job design, for those folks who look at job characteristics, the job design is really how you organize the job. In other words, do you have control over your job? Are you able to make decisions? Are you using a variety of skills in your job rather than just something repetitive? And do you have social support? So those are the things that I was looking at relative to job design. Now, when you look at these two, sorry, this is really exciting to me. When you look at these two different concepts, it's fascinating how really they are similar. When you look at healthy work, the theorists are saying, in order to have a healthy job, you need to have control over it. You need to make decisions, use a variety of skills, and have social support. Folks who are looking at successful aging saying, you need to have control over your life, over life choices. You need to have generativity, pass along life lessons, but also you need social and emotional support, okay? So my thought was that, hey, if these two constructs are so similar, perhaps we can look at a good job design really contributing or almost generalizing to successful aging. So my research question was, how does job design, in other words, how do the things that you do on your job, how does that relate to successful aging for older adults in the home building industry? My hypothesis was that I thought that some types of job design variables would promote this. The reason I chose the home building industry was because almost 18% of older workers probably will go into sales. Plus, it was actually fairly much easier for me to go into Home Depots because I could identify one big home building industry. So my inclusion criteria was that this was a little bit younger than retirement years. So these were folks who were 55 and older, which actually in Europe, okay, older workers are 45 and older, okay? Yeah, that's really depressing. So, okay, and we know in France that they're striking because they don't want to retire at age 61. Yeah, I'll move to France. So my inclusion criteria, they had to be 55 or older, and they had to be employed full or part-time. I did disseminate 145 surveys, and I had a fairly decent response rate of 81%. I used 4 different standardized instruments to measure successful aging and job design. So these were all Likert-like scales. And how many are familiar with that? Those are the type of scales that say, in terms of do you agree, disagree, not agree, or will never agree, that kind of thing. So you remember those 4 different options that you have. So I gave them indices of personal sense of control, generativity, the sense that you feel you're passing along information to younger generations, social-emotional scales, and these were the number of close contacts, as well as a degree of support. Okay, if this was a test, I would say, put a circle around the word close and put a star, because I'll come back to that later. Job design was something called the Job Content Questionnaire. And this is a questionnaire, again, that looks at these 4 different aspects. Do you have skill? Can you use skills? Do you make decisions? Do you have supervisor support? And do you have coworker support? So what I did is in collecting the data, first I did the doctoral student thing in terms of you contact the higher up folks at Lowe's and Home Depot and True Value, expecting that they will be so happy to help you because you're really giving such great information. You know, PR, everyone say, oh, older workers come here. However, they were not thrilled. Yeah. But what they didn't say no, and that was good enough for me after a while. You'll find out that if you don't say no, that is a go. So I basically went in, I did feel like I was kind of stalking older workers. I would go into, my kids are really sick of Home Depot's, Lowe's, True Values. They said, no, Mom, not another hardware store. So I would basically go into the different hardware stores, and I would walk up to older workers and explain what I was doing. Luckily, I was a little bit closer in age than you guys are, So it was a little bit believable. And I would plead, okay? I would also add, I did also have a Dunkin' Donuts gift certificate, and that was a coup de grace. So that really helped out. So I handed out the surveys and I collected them. And these were my results. So this looked like many of my workers. So I did go to over 70 home building stores. Yeah, it was a lot. It was 60% were independently owned. 60% were the True Values, independently owned ones. And almost 40% were the corporate, the Home Depot and the True Values. And the Lowe's. Most of the people had been at the job a mean of 9 years. So whereupon many people are saying that these are bridge jobs. So these are the folks that are the sales associates. So that you go into the store, you have no idea what you want or what you're looking for, and you go, okay, I'll speak for myself. And you ask an older worker, and they're very, very, very helpful. Whereupon many went into these quote unquote bridge jobs, or jobs which are jobs after their career. Many are staying in them for a long period of time. So they ranged at the jobs from 2 to 60 years. The mean was about 9 years. This was not a diverse group, which is fairly representative of folks in Home Depots and in hardware stores. They're mostly white males who were married. The mean was 64, but the range was 55 to 81. I did have a 91-year-old set up, but I kind of lost him by a week. He went into the hospital before I could get him. I was so upset. They were all in good health, and a fair amount of them had actually gone for at least 2 years of technical school. So when I look at the job design characteristics, so in other words, these are the 4 things I was concerned about: whether or not they can make decisions, use their skills, social and supervisor support. I translated this to a 4-point scale so you could kind of get an idea of where they fell on that scale. And if you look at it, it's all around 3 out of 4. So for these particular jobs, this particular sample of folks, this was a good job for them. They had opportunities to use their skills, make decisions, and they certainly had a lot of support. When I looked at the successful aging measures, which were these 4 things we talked about, they also had a fair amount, they had a significant amount of emotional support from others, close relationships. They did have the same or more close relationships than other peers relative to the literature. They felt they had control over their life, and they had generative experiences. So if you looked at these studies compared to other literature and peer samples, that this was a really high-functioning group. So to get back to what Kathy was saying, we'll talk about in just a second, we're not really sure, were they healthy because they're working, or do healthy folks, go back to work? Those are for the sociologists to figure out. So now this really got back to, this is probably the crux of my study, okay? Because again, I want to look at what is a good job design for older adults to promote successful aging. And what I found out was that generativity, there were 2 things that the job design contributed to, the 2 aspects of successful aging. And they were generativity and personal control. So that this good job enabled older adults to pass along knowledge to younger folks. And this was a fairly idealized setting. You're in the home building industry, and probably about 71% of those had worked in trades before. So if you had an older person who worked as an electrician, who was working in the electrical department, that person was able to pass on a fair amount of knowledge. But this was kind of exciting to me. 23% of total variance means that if you have a lot of things that contribute to generativity, only about 25% of that was able to come through work, which was really pretty exciting to me. Personal control also was big. In other words, those folks who were working felt that personal control, again, was one of the outcomes that they got through the job design. Interesting that emotional social network really were not impacted by work, which I thought it would be. So what were the most important job design variables? Be able to use your skills and coworker support. So if you were in a job design in which you could use your skills, a variety of them, and you had coworker support, these were the things that was most important to successful aging, and most specifically to the two aspects of successful aging that I just told you about. Interesting that for most of us, we would like to be able to make some decisions on our own, and that's important to most people on their job. But for the sample of older workers, it was really more important for them to be able to use their skills and to be able to interact with others and pass along this information. So this was interesting to me relative to the construct of healthy aging, or of healthy work, is a little bit different for older workers. So in this sample, just to summarize, these were successful agers by all measures that I looked at. So a sales associate job in the home building industry was healthy for the sample of workers. The hypothesis was partially supported. Job design contributed to generativity and personal control, but it really did not contribute to social network and emotional support. And I think the reason for that is the fact that the social network had to do with close relationships. And the reality is, when you're working, you get to talk to folks and you may share a little bit, but you really don't have the time to develop those really close personal relationships that you can really call upon when you need. But why? Why skill mastery and coworker support? And we try to think of why would these be the things that were most important to successful aging. And you guys might differ, and you might have your own interpretation, but the way I interpret it was that if you have a sense of being able to master your skills, or you have mastery and competence, this really can relate to a sense of having control over your environment or your future. If, in fact, you have a certain set of skills, then this is information or skills that you can pass along to other folks. Clearly, in the home building environment, younger workers were really interested in some of these older workers' skills. I can't say this is across the board, and that would be a really interesting thing to look at in other occupations. Coworker support promotes control over your social environment. So it's really looking again at social participation and how, in effect, does this affect your perception of controlling your larger life. Interesting, 97% felt that they passed along. So we get back to the discussions we meant before. Is this Roe and Kahn said that work is good for older workers, is it? Well, it looked to be, in this particular job, they're very active, they had cognitive stimulation, they were able to use their skills, and they certainly had support. The implications for businesses. If you were business majors, I would say, okay, you managers, okay, let's have you design jobs whereupon individuals can use their skills and they can interact with others. Let's promote intergenerational work and call upon workers to use their past experience. For older workers, okay, and here you are, I'd say, well, you know, work is good, but as long as it's a good job, okay? And that's probably, you know, key to anything. However, there can be generative experiences. For future directions, I would love to look more at generativity, okay? Because it was hard to know. Certainly, it passed on some specific knowledge, but could it be broader knowledge in terms of life experiences? We'd also need to look at this concept of bridge jobs, because many of these folks are saying, and don't tell Kathy this, that they were working to get away from their wife. I know. And so I guess the marriage trajectory was still there, but was a little bit of a deviation than is in all the literature, okay? And this really needs to be replicated with various industries. Certainly the limitations, or it was just one job position, it was a self-selected group of folks who could be infinitely happy with life. You never know. And it was a convenient sample, and certainly there was women and people with different backgrounds were underrepresented. But in conclusion, work experiences that can promote successful aging if, in fact, we highlight older workers' skills and social participation. Thank you. I spare the statistics if anyone wants to know and come up later. Oh. There you go.
All right, so thank you for sticking around, and thank you to my small but very lively group of PTs in the back. This is the second time I've done a presentation where the OT department was directing and organizing, and I'm stuck batting cleanup. So I will say that the last time I did this, my audience was looking a little more peaked than you all are. So kudos to the students for being able to stay awake. And just to make sure you don't, nod off on me, everybody stand up. Stand up. Step away so your hips are not touching your table. Put your feet shoulder width apart, hip width apart. Put your hands, let your hands relax, and then take a breath and lengthen your shoulder blades. So you lengthen your side body and you make space for your breath. Take a long inhale through your nose and then close your eyes. Feel your feet on the earth and say the mantra, I can stay awake. I can stay awake. I can stay awake. Now before you sit, please open your eyes. And when you do sit, try and stay up nice and tall. That also helps you to stay awake. So as Nancy said, my name is Kathleen Zettergren. I'm with the physical therapy department, and I'd like to answer Marcy's initial question as to how do we promote successful and healthy aging? Well, yoga. Yoga. That is how we promote successful aging. So I'm going to talk to you about a study I did a few years back here at Quinnipiac with the help of some excellent students in the physical therapy program and also a SURF grant through the university. I looked at the effectiveness of yoga on the risk of falling in community-dwelling older adults. And the definition of a community-dwelling older adult is similar to what Marcy and Kathy have been speaking about, individuals over the age of 65. And in my study, they were all people who were not hospitalized or living in a care facility. So the purpose of the study was to examine the effects of an 8-week program on certain variables of functional mobility. I'm a physical therapist. We're a little narrow-minded. We like to look at function. So postural control, mobility, rising from the floor, and gait speed in community living older adults. And the reason I choose these variables is because they predict falls. And when you improve things like mobility and gait speed, you reduce the risk of falling in people who are over 65. So they're important variables to study, and they're important variables to look at how can we intervene? How can we improve the quality of life in someone who is already successfully aging and wants to continue that? This is my mom. She was not in the study because she was excluded because, of course, she already practiced yoga. But she had to do some follow-up photographs because, sometimes your photographs don't come out great in the middle of the study. So the method was a pre-test, post-test design using several standardized measures of postural control, mobility, gait, and balance. And I provide you pictures to show that someone over 65 can participate in yoga completely, fully, and I'll show you some pictures of that later, but they can also participate in a way that you modify. So I never allow age to be a variable that prevents someone from participating in yoga. What you see in a magazine or on, in the movies, you do not have to be able to get your foot behind your ear to come to yoga class. It's not a prerequisite. Some of us do this for fun. That is not my mom's favorite pose, putting your foot behind her ear. So I recruited from local continuing care retirement communities, and for those of you who don't know that term, continuing care retirement communities are communities where a person who is 65 or older can enter in a healthy stage of their life when they're very active. But if they start to see a physical decline in their life, they're allowed to move throughout the community without completely leaving. So an example would be Ashlar Village, which is close by here. And Ashlar Village has several stages of independent living, semi-independent living, hospitalization, and even in a more acute area. So it's a great way for people to age in place and stick with their friends, their caregivers, and with all the services that are provided. The control subjects were recruited from a different setting after I finished the intervention study, and a sample of convenience was used. I did screen everyone who volunteered, so as Marcy said, you go in, you talk, you beg. I did a free lecture at both of the facilities, and the lectures are actually extremely well attended. It's the post-lecture, will you now commit to twice a week for 8 weeks? And I didn't have money to pay the subjects. I go with the pitch of, but it's free yoga, and my big fake smile. And then once they come down for pre-screening, everyone has to be over 65. They have to be able to maintain static standing with their eyes open and arms crossed, because we did do some testing at the motion analysis lab, which I'm not presenting that data today, but this is a prereq for the force plate data. They have to have intact lower extremity sensation. Lack of lower extremity sensation is a risk for fall, and it confounds the other variables. So it causes things to change in my testing that might not be related to yoga. Visual acuity, which can be corrected, and the mini mental status exam must be greater than or equal to 24. So y'all understand that people with cognitive deficits are a protected population, and although I would love to study people with impaired cognition, because impaired cognition is also a risk for fall, it's more difficult to do in the university setting. So we go with people who really understand and can follow directions, and when you explain to them you have a right to leave the study with no consequences, they really need to understand that, so they don't feel badly for you that, my husband is sick, I can't be in your study anymore. Well, that's okay. That's part of being a researcher. People were excluded if they had history of neurologic pathology or recent surgery, serious visual impairments, and these gait speeds are normal gait speeds for men and women who are over 65. So I didn't want anyone who already ambulated at a self-selected speed that was higher than normal. That would indicate they were part of this incredibly well elderly group. Do you guys have grandma and grandpa who still ski? Right, so they would not be in my study. They're extremely well elderly, they're aging fantastically, and an 8-week dose of yoga probably isn't going to change their function at all. So it was one of my exclusion criteria. All the subjects came for a round of pre-tests. So we administered the Berg Balance Scale, the timed up and go, which is called the TUG, measured gait speed, both self-selected and fast, and the activities-specific balance confidence scale. Then the intervention group received yoga classes twice a week for 90 minutes over an 8-week period. And I did have excellent attendance. About, I think 80% of the subjects attended 100% of the yoga. So once they got going, they really like it. And one selling point, if you will, is I went to them. They were residents at Ashlar Village. I went to Ashlar Village. So no one had to drive. No one had to come to me. I brought equipment with me. I brought the music with me. They just have to show up and do their thing, and then they go have lunch. The yoga was a well-rounded class that began in seated, included meditation, pranayama, which is work on the breath, and asana, both sitting, standing, and seated on the floor. The class itself was designed with literature in mind, so muscles that contribute to prevention of falling were targeted. Positions that contribute to prevention of falling were targeted. So I could look at function as I could look at increased strength as it relates to function. So hoping to increase strength in lower extremity muscles that subsequently change variables that prevent falling. So this was the longest part of the preparation, is choosing the right postures. And then post-testing occurred immediately after the 8-week session. So go ahead and stand up and try Vrikshasana. My mom is 70. I have a small window of time to catch this photograph of her without the chair, but she can hold it long enough to be photographed. So stand on one foot.
Are we allowed to hold the chair?
You are not allowed to hold the chair. She's 70 years old. One foot down, put the base of your other foot up against your shin, and then you can do a little light touch to work yourself up if you must, okay? All right?
If you have to hold this.
Well, how old are you?
60.
60, 15 seconds.
Oh, man,
Students, 30 seconds.
oh, good.
Close your eyes. Try not to fall into your partner unless, of course, you know. Okay. So let me ask the students in the crowd. Why do you think I would use a pose that seems so difficult? Why do you think I chose this pose to include in the series? Single leg stance. And how you don't really know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask you anyways. How does single leg stance relate to falls? Well, the inability to perform single limb support is a predictor of an injury-laden fall. It doesn't predict all falls, but if you do fall, you're likely to have an injury. Somebody else over here? Yes.
I was just going to say that a lot of falls could happen with either, reaching for something on like your tiptoes or putting more weight on one leg than the other when you're reaching or bending down.
So practicing shifting weight, practicing balance helps in a functional task, say in the kitchen or at the grocery store, things like that. So Vrikshasana is an important posture for the balance aspect, but also, did you notice how hard your one foot was working while you were standing? Strengthening of anterior tibialis muscle is a significant predictor of reducing falls. Standing on one foot is a great way to do that. And so I do it in the context of an asana. And voila. So what I ended up with was 8 research subjects, mean age of 84. 8 control subjects, mean age of 82. My controls, we had some men. My subjects, we had women. And I will say I never ask this question about working, but from what I recall, all of my research subjects were retired. All of my control subjects were retired except for one of the women, the youngest women. But that's just, it's just a recollection. I didn't actually ask the question. There were no significant differences between the groups when we began. A statistically significant increase was noted on the Berg balance scale, which is a good thing. You want that scale to increase. A statistically significant increase in fast gait speed was also noticed, which is also a good thing. So self-selected speed of ambulating did not change, but fast gait did. Tug scores, the time to up and go, and time to rise from standing. So we measured lie down on the floor, get up into standing as fast as you can. These scores also decreased, which is what you want in a time test. You want it to decrease which were clinically meaningful but not statistically significant, and no other significant changes were noted. So this is important for those of you students who are getting up into your graduate research studies, thinking of doing research. When we look at function, there's a difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. And the more people like Marcy and myself get into the literature and the research, the more information we're starting to dig out as far as what do we really want to change. So the minimal detectable change for a Berg balance score is suggested to be at least 5.7 points. So you want to see an increase in at least 5.7 points on someone's score on the Berg balance scale to say, yes, you made a clinical change. We did not find that. I did not find that. I only found 3.5 points, but it was statistically significant. So I have to be able to interpret the statistics in light of the clinical changes. Did I really make a clinically meaningful change, or is it really just the numbers? I'm not sure yet. Minimal change for the tug is 1 to 2.49 seconds. Our subjects were 0.97, so it was very close to MDC. And again, this was a statistically significant change with a very small number of subjects. So I'm saying to you, learn your statistics, as painful as it is, so you can really apply the research to your patients, because that's the point. We want to make our treatments more effective because of literature. MDC for fast gait speed is 0.18. We scored a 0.17, so we had both MDC and statistical significance on fast gait speed, which Marcy gets excited about, you know, job stuff. This is what makes me happy at night, right here. Because fast gait speed is a huge predictor of falls. The faster I can teach you how to ambulate, the less likely you are to fall, the more functional you will be. And I think, this personal, unpublished opinion, I think quality of life improves. And I would love to measure that with you, Marcy. MDC for rising from the floor is not known. The reason we measured that is because it's highly functional. It's shown in the literature that if you fall, the longer you stay on the floor, the more likely you are to be more injured, suffer more injuries. So if you fall and you can get up and receive help, you'll have fewer injuries. So we don't have a lot of data on this test, but I think it's important to look at. So the preliminary data, and I say preliminary because it's only 8 subjects, suggests that yoga improves postural control, mobility, and gait. And this is an opinion based on looking at the literature on community-based exercise. So, you know, community-based exercise as a whole, yoga as a piece. To me, yoga offers a safe and effective alternative for aging adults. I had similar problems to Marcy. It was not randomized sampling, so people are self-selected. So you have to ask the question, well, is someone who volunteers more likely to be healthier anyway at their baseline? The sample size is small, and talking to the statistician, we really have been talking about dosage. Should we have gone longer? And my answer to that is I'm pretty sure yes. In my next study, I would like to go longer with a larger sample size. That's my goal, so there's that. And if possible to randomize the subjects, it's very difficult because you're asking people to make a significant commitment twice a week for next time I ask them it'll be 3 months. And my subjects, my intervention group, they were busy women, busy women. So yoga had to be before lunch and after tennis, but before golf. They were busy ladies. And I guess we're holding questions. All right. Thank you.
So what we're going to do is we'll invite Julianne and then Keneal, and then we'll open it up for questions. So you want to come on up and offer some of your thoughts?
Well, I thought that all of the presentations were very interesting, and as a gerontology major, I could definitely relate a little bit more to the first two presentations because I don't really focus a lot on like health sciences. I don't take a lot of those classes. But I thought it was interesting. One of the classes that I'm in right now is a counseling older clients class, and we have to have a consultant for our class, and we interview them, and we're kind of analyzing their lives, the different dimensions of their lives, so like the physical dimension, social, psychological, etc. And for my consultant, I picked my grandmother, and she's 78 years old, and she still does work. So I see like how much of a positive effect it has on her life. It just keeps her so active and busy, and it gives her something to do. Her social network expands because of it. She has a lot of friends that she knows through working. And I definitely think that it has a positive effect on her life. So I thought that was interesting. And then I was a little bit surprised that I could relate to the physical therapy presentation. I'm actually looking into getting an internship next semester at Yale New Haven Hospital. They have a program there, their Elder Horizons program, where they do different therapies and exercises to rehabilitate patients that have been elderly patients that have been in the hospital, to kind of get them ready for life on their own once they leave the hospital. So I thought that that was really interesting, using like the yoga and everything, because I think that that's what they do there, and I definitely think that that would help have a positive effect on their lives too. So, well,
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Oh, my lady's in the back. Hope that's not on camera. It's like I'm very interested in older adults, and in our research class, which is taught by Marcy Sanders, I initially started researching falls and fear of falling in older adults. So your presentation about fears of falling is very interesting, and in researching the topic, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention says that 1 in 3 older adults fall each year. So that's very significant. And not only the fact that older adults fall, which increases their risk of falling again, but just the fear of falling limits a person from participating in their daily occupations. So I thought that was very interesting. In regards to Kathy's presentation and retirement, and how does an older adult transition from being in the workforce to retirement? Does someone help them with that transition? Do they know that, okay, today I was working as an accountant or a teacher, and tomorrow I'm home, what do I do? And the whole quality of life aspect comes to light. If a person was a teacher, as occupational therapist, you would help them to use your skills, for example, being a volunteer at a literacy program, tutoring people in the community. So it's important that older adults have a plan before they reach the retirement age and have to say, what do I do? So I thought that was very interesting. And in Marcy's presentation about working, it's not just the case that you just want older adults just to work, but we have to find that match. Is the job design appropriate for them? And the topic of generativity is very interesting to me in the sense of the older generation working with the younger generation. There's a lot of communication and a lot of information that is transferred in those interactions, and having clients or having older adults, having that reinforcement in the workforce, having someone to go to when they need help, having the opportunity just to share, to feel as if they are having a purpose in the job, not just being a sales associate, but transferring that knowledge to others. So I thought that was interesting. So I do thank all the presenters for presenting, and it just shows how different disciplines approach this same topic of older adults and aging. And it's very important that we don't isolate ourselves as clinicians saying, I'm just going to see this person in this light, but how can we all work together to bring about an older adult being functional, being active in their daily lives? Because there's a lot to learn from older adults, and they're willing to learn from us. Kathy was saying the texting aspect. That would be kind of interesting if my grandma like texts me in class, be like, "Grandma, I'm studying for exam here," like, you know. But it just goes to show that with the statistic you were saying that in 2030 is going to rise another 8%. And it's not the case that we can just sweep that fact under the rug. We have to address it because it's going to come. And how do we address it? So bringing attention now so that we can better prepare is a good thing. So thank you.
So now we'd like to open up to questions. So if anybody in the audience has any questions, the panelists, if you want to come up to the front so we have a microphone so they can hear your answers, that would be great. Who'd like to start us off with a question?
Sure, I'm always good for one question. Okay, so all of you, whether you're the people who have studied aging or you have now discussed what others have studied, has either what you've heard or all of you professors, what you found, changed your ideas about what you will do as you grow older? Are you going to do something different as a result, Kathy, of learning about life satisfaction in retirement? The other Kathy, are you going to do yoga even more because Marcy, are you going to go to Home Depot and get a job?
What's happening there?
Or are you going to do something differently because of the kinds of things you've heard or learned about in your classes?
I mean, it's definitely, it's ringing in my ear that this is a huge topic. And it's going to be a huge field where occupational therapists are going to be needed. And given the fact that I have a tendency to draw to older adults, not just in the OT aspect, but just being a person, relating to my grandparents and just having that connection with them. But having that ringing in my ear, you see it on the news, Medicare, Medicaid, and all the issues, fall prevention, that definitely is an option for me to go in that area to practice. And I definitely think that OT, sociologists, physical therapists, and other disciplines, there's a need for all of us to come together to address this issue because, as Kathy was saying, that it's going to impact policymaking. And we are at an important time where we can put in our input now so that when the time comes, we're prepared versus trying to catch up because the political world can be a mess. And trying to change things after things have been put in ink is very difficult. So putting our input now, I think it's important.
Well, and this doesn't really answer your question, Lynn, but kind of building on what you're saying is that, oftentimes when students take my sociology of aging class, it's like they're like, oh wait, aren't all old people aren't sick and in nursing home beds? Like, no. I mean, they're out there doing yoga and they're working at Home Depot and they're doing these. I mean, think about your grandparents. They're just like your grandparents. So I think that one of the things to realize is that gerontology is not a depressing field.
Thank you.
It's like, yay, old people. So, I mean, seriously, this is something that everybody should consider going into, minoring in or double majoring in, whatever, because really it really is going to be a huge need in healthcare in terms of.
That's what there are jobs now.
Yeah. But I'm definitely going to start doing yoga.
I'm going to do yoga too. Good. Can we go?
I definitely will be doing more yoga when I retire. There's no such thing as too much yoga.
When you could tell that I was really kind of intrigued by this concept of generativity. It was somewhat new to me. And it really made me think, I know that now I'm going to give you a little esoteric, generativity is really culturally determined. So in other words, in order for an older adult to pass along information to a younger person, they have to value the information. And I think if you look at the literature, it is really in transition, or we're really losing it. So Home Depot was great because the younger folks really valued the information, but in society, really younger kids, and I'll even speak for my kids, if they're into the iPods and the Wii, and my dad, who has macular degeneration, he can't even see this stuff. There's a disconnect that is really happening. And so it really made me think, how can we promote this? Because it's working in this workplace, but it doesn't work in some of the other workplaces. So that kind of was a kind of a tease to me that I'll think about more in the future.
Marcy, I'm not sure I heard this right or not. Did you say or find that the generativity was more important or more prevalent than the making your own decisions, taking charge?
Yeah, it was.
Can you comment some more on that? I find that's quite interesting.
It
And do you think
was.
that would be true of those same people earlier, or has it changed?
Well, my kind of thoughts about this were that typically for us as workers, decision making is really important. But for these folks, it was almost like they were past the career stuff. They didn't care about climbing the career ladder. They didn't care about getting a promotion. So they were truly, truly happy, and I'm not being negative here. They appreciated the fact they wanted to interact with individuals, and they obviously wanted to pass along information, and that was more important than making their pledge to the boss that they could control or get higher in the department or get promotions. So I think a lot had to do with being where they were in life relative to promotions and careers. I mean, it goes back this whole day. I think the concept of bridge jobs is a lot different than the concepts of jobs. Bridge jobs are those transitional jobs like the Home Depots and the greeters. Okay, so I think people are in those for different reasons than we are in our entire careers.
Although it was interesting because in your study, I mean, you found that even though we think of Home Depot as a bridge, they were working there for a long time.
Yeah.
So
they were. Some had been there for over 15 years.
Yeah.
So it's a concept we really need to look at. I mean, I'll go up and digress here, but I think we could be so much more creative about jobs for older workers in these. It could be a specialist. It could be a consultant role. It could be mentoring. So I think we can really, really look at this whole area and be much more creative what we do with our older workers rather than just sales associates, which is what they are doing right now.
So we'd love to have some student questions.
Also speaking a little bit about generativity, I used to volunteer at the Connecticut Hospice, and I sensed almost in more of an urgency for the need for generativity. Have you seen, or do you I know you did a lot with your dissertation in generativity, the relationship between health status and generativity?
Well, this was actually a really healthy group of folks. So I probably can't speak to those who are less healthy. I think that is a great question. Over in like 90% of these perceive themselves to be healthy. So I'm not sure if anyone else can speak to that. Certainly those who are healthy are out there and passing along information. So I would imagine if you're not as healthy, it's just, a bit harder. But I can't really speak to it based on the study. I'm not sure if anyone else can.
I mean, I think that part of that is that we can conceptualize generativity in different ways, and that just because you're in poor health status when you're old, there are other ways that you can give back to people who take care of you or family members, and so.
I mean, traditionally, way back when older adults lived in the same homes as their families and their grandkids, it probably wasn't an issue because, even if your health isn't great, you're still around your grandchildren. But now, if older adults are in assisted living, or if they're not living in the same community as their grandchildren, and this was the typical people that they passed along information to, it is more of a challenge. So this is going off, but I really, for community centers, I love seeing intergenerational, have daycare centers go to community centers. So we almost have to create something that used to be there, an institution, that the institution has really changed and shifted.
Barbara.
This is a little bit more selective. A lot of people do a lot of different research, but a lot of the research that's done, especially with the elderly population, is usually in a civilian capacity. I'm ex-military, so I'm really talking from a societal perspective. Does either of you have any interest in doing any type of research that is not just based on the civilian, the Joe public, for lack of a better term, have any direction towards finding those individuals who are active But at this stage, there's no link between how they're aging in our society as being on the civilian side. Has anyone had any interest in doing the research in that direction?
If they want to do yoga. There's also a brand new study starting. It's through the Kripalu Yoga Center up in the Massachusetts area, looking at the effects of yoga on PTSD. It's not in a client population of 65 and older. It's in the current soldiers coming out, but I suspect that their results will be positive, and then going back and looking at older soldiers, older adults who have served and are now, in a civilian life. I think that's a great line of investigation. You can call.
Other questions? Yeah. This question is actually for Professor Solomon. In regards to programs such as yoga or water aerobics, have you seen a significant societal trend at all in the past recent years now that there's more of a push for exercise for the elderly?
Well, yeah, I mean, specifically among the young old people, 65 to 74, they're more active, so they are doing more of those like water aerobics and yoga. And I mean, the gym that I go to in North Haven, when I go there, it's like all people over 65. Granted, it's 5 o'clock in the morning, so they're up early, but I'm working at next to somebody who's like 70 years old. So in fact, there's this one woman there who is 67, and she's in way better shape than I could. I mean, she's ripped, and she's there every morning at 5 o'clock with her trainer. And one day she said, "Oh yeah, pretty good for a 67-year-old." I was like, "I thought you were like in your 40s." So I think that there is kind of an upward trend and more activity. Yeah.
And I also think that a lot of people in general are taking ownership with their health, and taking the initiative to prevent certain illnesses, all about prevention. So it's not necessarily the case that it's just middle-aged adults who are saying, I'm going to try to prevent developing diabetes, but older adults are saying that I want to be as active as I can be, as long as I can be. And you see that push where in community centers they have the WE program, doing WE exercises, or they're doing yoga, or they're doing Tai Chi or Qigong. So I think a lot of older adults are standing up for themselves and saying that I'm not going to be stuck in a nursing home. 65 is not the number. I'm going to obey that number and say I'm going to assisted living. They're saying that I'm going to live as long as I can, and I think that we're seeing that trend with taking measures to prevent illnesses or prevent.
And it's certainly
conditions.
consistent with the Healthy People 2010, because we're really looking at it minimizing the length of disability. So staying very, very active, and instead of having a disability for 30 years, is being active, and then limiting it to maybe a year or something like that. That is the hope of the future, essentially.
So a lot of these folks, at least from the studies that were presented, they seem to be fairly well situated financially, and they seem pretty racially homogenous as well. Obviously, Kathy, you haven't done your study yet, and I saw that you mentioned that. I was wondering then what potential issues might be for those folks that really are working, not because they want to pass on information, but because they have to work, and if they don't work those 40 hours, then they can't pay for their prescriptions. And so I would imagine there would be a different level of stress, just because there's a very different reason for working in that situation than similarly to be able to be in an assisted living facility. I know that those are often rather expensive, and then have the free time. I mean, so it definitely seems that there's a significant class issue here that we're talking about, and then what the implications might be for those older adults that don't have time to do yoga in the morning before golf and tennis, and those folks that really are working, how that, obviously that's a big topic, but how it would affect their aging.
Well, I can speak to that to some degree. I did a case study, so this was just individual, but this was older adults who are in physically demanding jobs like custodians. And you are absolutely correct that these folks, they're basically working because they need health care insurance, okay? And they had a lot of difficulty in adapting to the job. So they made their own adaptations because they didn't want to use the ADA. Basically, they didn't want to tell their supervisors that they had issues. So there is no doubt, if someone's been in a challenging job, you know, they would just as soon left the job because it was really, really hard for them. So there's no doubt. I think there are a whole other host of issues if that is a primary reason that you're working. Yeah. And I think we can do a better job for occupational therapists and gerontologists can actually do a better job in looking to adapt the job proactively. And again, I'll make a little a little banner for ergonomics, but you guys get that next semester. But there are a lot of adaptations that they can do, but generally human resources and a lot of institutions don't recognize it. So instead, again, being proactive so they can stay in the job longer, they're kind of scooting around and getting hurt and finally, you know, leave because of that. So you're absolutely right about that.
Any other questions? I have a host of questions, but I'll start with one. I'm interested in policy, and particularly in our recent elections, issues related to aging and healthcare policy and what's happening in France. I think there's just so many issues right now related to older adults that relate to working, and I'm wondering if you could comment on some of the political nature of this subject in terms of retirement age, for example. I mean, a lot of people are very upset about this idea of changing retirement age in terms of what it means for the next generation, for the students' generation. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to comment on that.
Sure, I'll start. I'm not sure. I mean, is your question just kind of a general?
Yeah, what's your take on what's happening politically in terms of where we stand on these issues and where political parties stand? And
I think that it kind of relates back, your question relates back to Melissa's question about class and health, that, you know, for people who are in poor health and who are lower class, that having to work until 65, 67 now, to wait until Social Security until you can quit your job is a real burden. So, and then for people who have lots of money, it doesn't really matter that much because you have your own pension, you have a nice retirement nest egg, so that Social Security is pushed back 2 years might not affect you that much because it's such a small proportion of your retirement income. But I think that it really impacts people who are lower income and who are in poor health, who they want to quit their job, but they can't afford to because Social Security isn't going to kick in, and Medicare isn't going to kick in until you're 67. So I think it can have more detrimental effects to people who are suffering in terms of health status and economic status.
Well, the other issue with policy is the ADAA, the Age Discrimination Employment Act. And that stuff, do most people know what that is? It's basically an act that says there can't be age discrimination in the workplace. So if there are people applying for a job, just because you're older and you're qualified doesn't mean that you can't get the job. But it's not enforced, and people think that, I can see that being more and more prevalent. With the folks that I looked at was just bridge jobs. They were happy, but if you're looking at a career job, I can see that age discrimination could be an issue. If people are really staying in the workforce until age 70, they might want to stay in their career jobs longer or go get another job which might be with higher pay. So that could be. It's not really enforced, but it continues to be an issue for many folks.
We have time for one last question, if there is one. Okay. Well, why don't we thank everybody.